So, if you're unaware, Jews are vastly overrepresented in a number of industries and positions of authority in the United States, despite comprising less than 3% of the population. Now, there are plenty of videos and articles out there that highlight this fact better than I intend to, but to give you an idea, here are some things to consider. 3 out of 9 Supreme Court justices are Jewish, 8% of Congress is Jewish. There's also a number of past and present cabinet members with dual American-Israeli citizenship. This is an interesting fact in and of itself, because were it altered to reflect dual citizenship with Russia, it probably would have been a major media talking point ever since Donald Trump took office. Speaking of which, Jews are also very overrepresented in the ownership and management of all the major corporations that distribute American media. Jews also have a 1-to-1 ratio with whites in Ivy League university enrollment, and what's more is that most of these institutions are run by Jews. Recently, Asian American groups have filed a discrimination lawsuit against Harvard. The irony in this is that Jews used to complain about white Anglo-Saxon Protestants keeping them out. Now Jews are on the inside, and it's Asians who are complaining. Now, to explain their overrepresentation, Jordan Peterson highlights in a blog post that Ashkenazi Jews have a mean IQ of 115, and that Europeans have a mean IQ of 100, which is a full standard deviation lower. Because of how bell curve distributions work, this potentially reveals that 40% of Americans with IQs above 145 are Jewish, even though Jews are less than 3% of the population. This is Peterson's main argument, that Jewish overrepresentation is commensurate with the cognitive demand of any given field they're found in. As he points out, the numbers even neatly coincide with 40% of millionaires and billionaires being Jewish. This is a powerful argument on the surface, but it doesn't take into account the phenomenon of intellectual exclusion. The probability of entering and remaining in an intellectually elite profession such as physician, judge, professor, scientist, corporate executive, etc. increases with IQ to about 133. It then falls about a third by 140. By 150, the probability has fallen by 97%. In other words, a significant percentage of people with IQs over 140 are often excluded from what Peterson might call positions of authority, competence, and influence. Using the figures cited in Peterson's blog post, 2.1% of the white American population would score above 130, while 15.8% of Jewish Americans would. That's 4.2 million white Americans and 948,000 Jewish Americans with IQs greater than 130. Moreover, the 115 figure itself is somewhat problematic. That figure comes from studies of limited populations and from select private Jewish American schools. A more reasonable estimate of the Ashkenazi IQ might be about 110, although some people dispute that as well and propose something like 107, which is on par with some East Asian groups. Personally, I lean more toward the estimate of 110 cited in Richard Lynn's book on Jewish intelligence and achievement. This is still very high and quite meaningful, although, if anything, it somewhat leaves the overrepresentation of Jews even more unexplained. Now, many people are fixated on the fact that Israel has an IQ of 95, so before continuing, I would like to address this. Israel is made up of various Jewish ethnicities and a sizable Arab population, all of whom score differently on IQ. Taking this into account, a national IQ of 95 is actually quite plausible. Now, while Ethiopian Jews are in no way genetically related to the other Jewish ethnicities, generally speaking, Jews are an ethno-religious group with a DNA component. In fact, geneticists have been excited to study Jewish DNA precisely because, over the course of their 3,000-plus year history, they've practiced a highly restrictive form of endogamy. As much as it may offend modern sensibilities, on a genetic basis it is entirely possible to be more or less Jewish than someone else, just as it is possible to be more or less Japanese, Nigerian, or German.
Until the mid-20th century, Jews throughout the world remained an incredibly insular group. Intermarriage averaged just 0.5%. And that very insularity has made Jews the perfect specimens for genetic research.
It's one of the few religions, other than, let's say, Zoroastrianism, which is really a tribal religion still. It's beyond faith and culture. It's based on ancestry. It's a blood religion. Many Jews say with no contradiction, I'm an atheist Jew or an agnostic Jew. No other religion can make that claim.
Who's white exactly? Like, how do you draw these distinctions? Which is the problem, of course, the intersection left has run into.
So now that we're mostly on the same page in terms of Jewish intelligence, let's move on to Jordan Peterson's other assertions in his blog post. Referring to Jewish intellectuals, he asks, quote, "Is the fact that smart people are working hard for our mutual advancement really something to feel upset about?" Unquote. Well, Peterson himself has pointed out on more than one occasion that IQ is only a metric of how quickly a person can perform complex tasks. It's not a measure of kinship, in-group identity, altruism, or anything else. And yet Peterson ignores how ethnic groups of unequal intelligence have historically interacted with one another. For example, Europeans with a mean IQ of 100 were probably not working toward the mutual advancement of Africans with a mean IQ of 70 when they captured and enslaved them. The Bantu people, likewise, were not working toward the mutual advancement of the Pygmies when they captured and enslaved them. This is the overwhelming trend with virtually any set of ethnic groups of disparate intelligence, even ones situated within broader racial categories such as the Scots and the English. According to the Jewish Encyclopedia, by the 6th and 7th centuries, Jews had become the chief slave traders in Italy and were also active in Gallic territories as well. By the 9th and 10th centuries, Jewish merchants, sometimes called Radhanites, were a major force in the trade throughout the entire continent. Now, Jews were certainly not the only players in this trade, but nonetheless, they were one of the few groups who could move freely between the Christian and Islamic worlds at the time. The 9th century Islamic scholar Ibn Cordoba observed and recorded routes of Jewish merchants from the south of France to Spain, and he noted the presence of female slaves, eunuch slaves, and young slave boys. He also noted Jews purchasing Slavic slaves in Prague. The Jewish population of Crimea was also a very important factor in the slave trade in that region during the 16th to 18th centuries. This was not an entirely small trade either, as some estimates record as many as 200,000 captives being brought to the area in the 16th century alone. In the 9th century, Louis the Fair is recorded to have granted charters to Jews visiting his kingdom, permitting them to possess and sell slaves, provided the latter had not been baptized. The Archbishop of Lyon claimed, however, that notwithstanding this provision, the Jews kept Christians as slaves regardless, citing the instance of a Christian refugee from Cordoba who declared that his co-religionists were frequently sold, as he had been, to the Muslim Moors. Following their expulsion from Spain and Portugal in the 1490s, many Sephardic Jews moved to Brazil and Suriname and held a number of large slave plantations there. According to Jewish author Herbert Bloom, quote, "The Christian inhabitants of Brazil were envious because the Jews owned some of the best plantations in the river valley of Pernambuco and were among the leading slaveholders and slave traders in the colony," unquote. Jewish historian Mark Lee Raphael wrote, quote, "Jews also took an active part in the Dutch colonial slave trade. Indeed, the bylaws of the Recife and Mauricia congregations included an imposta of 5 soldos for each Negro slave a Brazilian Jew purchased from the West Indies Company. Slave auctions were postponed if they fell on a Jewish holiday. In Curaçao in the 17th century, as well as in the British colonies of Barbados and Jamaica in the 18th century, Jewish merchants played a major role in the slave trade. In fact, in all the American colonies, whether French, British, or Dutch, Jewish merchants frequently dominated," unquote. In reference to the early period of the 18th century in the United States, the Jewish Encyclopedia also says that, quote, "The Jews of Georgia found the production of indigo, rice, corn, tobacco, and cotton more profitable. In fact, many of the cotton plantations in the South were wholly in the hands of the Jews, and as a consequence, slavery found its advocates among them," unquote. Jacob Rader Marcus, another Jewish historian, wrote that over 75% of Jewish families in Charleston, South Carolina, Richmond, Virginia, and Savannah, Georgia owned slaves, and nearly 40% of Jewish households across the country owned slaves. Granted, the Jewish population in the US at the time of slavery was very low, perhaps as low as 150,000 in 1860. Even so, the most liberal estimates of slave ownership in white households only gets up to about 25%, and conservative estimates are around 7%. Now, this doesn't mean that the number of slaves owned by Jews exceeded the number of slaves owned by whites, nor does it mean that Jews ran the entire Atlantic slave trade. What it means is that if you went back in time to 1860 and randomly selected a Jewish American and a white American, the Jewish American would be more likely to own slaves. In other words, Jews were overrepresented in slave ownership. The point here, though, is not to demonize them, but rather to highlight that simply because an ethnic group is highly intelligent, it doesn't necessarily follow that they will engage in altruistic behavior or work toward the mutual advancement of outgroups. Jordan Peterson supposedly detests identity politics, and yet, time and time again, he ignores the Jewish variety of them. In his blog post, he starts off by saying, quote, "The players of identity politics on the far right continue ever so pathologically to beat the anti-Semitic drum, pointing to the overrepresentation of Jews in positions of authority, competence, and influence, including revolutionary movements. I'm called upon, sometimes publicly, sometimes on social media platforms, to comment on such matters, and criticized when I hesitate to do so," unquote. Peterson then goes on to define identity politics. Quote, "If you're misguided enough to play identity politics, whether on the left or the right, then you require a victim and a perpetrator. Otherwise, you can't play the game. Once you determine to play, however, you benefit in a number of ways. You can claim responsibility for the accomplishments of your group you feel racially, ethnically akin to, without actually having to accomplish anything yourself. That's convenient. You can identify with the hypothetical victimization of that group and feel sorry for yourself and pleased at your compassion simultaneously. Another unearned victory. You simplify your world radically as well. All the problems you face now have a cause and a single one, so you can dispense with the unpleasant difficulty of thinking things through in detail. Bonus, furthermore, and most reprehensibly, you now have someone to hate, so your unrecognized resentment and cowardly and incompetent failure to deal with the world forthrightly can find a target, and you can feel morally superior in your consequent persecution," unquote. Well, do individual Jews identify with the victimization of people with whom they feel racially and ethnically akin? Do they not single out perpetrators to hate and to blame their problems on? Do Jewish individuals not claim responsibility for the accomplishments of other Jews without having done anything themselves?
There's something extraordinarily dangerous about having people revert to identification with their racial identity.
Jordan Peterson rails against identity politics, and yet he never comments on how 3 successive generations of German individuals have been obligated to pay out billions of dollars to Israel in reparations. This is not to say, however, that Germany didn't bear any responsibility for the atrocities they committed in World War II, but let's not kid ourselves. The German-Israeli reparations are based purely on multi-generational identity politics, and I fail to see how this doesn't violate Peterson's divine sovereignty of the individual.
Die Waffen haben Sie an Bord, nicht?
I don't speak Nazi.
Not only do many Jews play his detested brand of identity politics, but they also often do so by a different set of rules. For example, CNN recently fired Mark Lamont Hill for allegedly using coded anti-Semitic language, while Don Lemon, without suffering any consequence, repeatedly called white men in America the biggest terrorist threat and said that something needed to be done about them. The establishment today has also been very concerned with some Russian woman having joined the NRA and who apparently sought to establish unofficial channels of communication between Russia and Republican Party officials. Yet no one seems to recall that Israel has stolen sensitive US secrets before and has repeatedly sought to influence our elections and foreign policy. Jonathan Pollard, a Jewish American born in Texas, stole and handed over top secret US material to Israel in the mid-1980s. That material eventually fell into the hands of the Soviet Union. Pollard was caught, arrested, pled guilty to spying for Israel, and then was sentenced to life in prison. When asked why he did it, he said he felt a, quote, strong racial obligation to Israel. And over the last 33 years, Israel has reciprocated this obligation. They've made repeated attempts through official and unofficial channels to secure his release. They granted him Israeli citizenship in 1995, and in 2007, they even named a public square after him. Today, they're currently lobbying the Trump administration to pardon him and allow him to invoke his right of return to Israel. As an aside, this is evidence that neither Jews or Israelis have absolute control over the US government. If they did, Pollard would already have been released. Or perhaps he never would have been prosecuted. Or perhaps Israel wouldn't have needed his services to begin with. However, this doesn't negate the ethnocentric, self-serving result that Jews in positions of authority, competence, and influence may affect on foreign and domestic policy. In order to keep government jobs in an increasing number of states, today Americans must sign an agreement never to boycott Israel. In fact, some Texans couldn't even receive government aid after Hurricane Harvey unless they first signed said agreement.